Russia's air defense network, the system Moscow spent 20 years and tens of billions of dollars building, did not protect Moscow last night. Let that settle for a moment. Not a border region, not a forward operating zone. Moscow, the capital, the symbolic and administrative center of the Russian state. And what Ukraine did to it was not an accident, not a one-off lucky strike, and not a tactical improvisation. What you witnessed was the deliberate, systematic, and now demonstrably successful dismantling of the foundational assumption on which Russia built its entire conception of strategic depth. I want to be precise about something before we go any further. When mainstream coverage describes what happened, they will use words like raid, incursion, drone attack. Those words are technically accurate and strategically useless. They describe the instrument. They completely miss the lesson. What Ukraine executed was not a raid. It was a proof of concept operation that exposed the structural bankruptcy of layered air defense when the attacker controls the geometry, the saturation ratio, and the decision timeline. Russia's air defense architecture did not fail because of bad luck. It failed because it was built on assumptions Ukraine has now methodically and irreversibly rendered obsolete. That is what this analysis is about. Not the drones, not the fires over Moscow. The collapse of the doctrine that was supposed to make those fires impossible. Pull the lens back to where this story actually begins, because to understand why last night matters at the strategic level, you have to understand what Russia thought it had built and why that belief was not merely optimistic. It was structurally delusional. Russia's integrated air defense architecture, what NATO planners call the A2AD envelope, was never designed primarily to stop small, slow, cheap aerial vehicles. It was designed to stop what Russia assumed its adversaries would send: cruise missiles traveling at high subsonic speed, fixed-wing aircraft operating at medium to high altitude, ballistic re-entry vehicles following predictable trajectories. The entire sensor-to-shooter architecture, the S-300 variants, the S-400 batteries, the Pantsir short-range engagement systems, the overlapping radar networks, the command and control nodes, was optimized, calibrated, and tested against those threat profiles. That is not speculation. That is the documented procurement logic of the Russian Defense Ministry across 2 decades of post-Cold War modernization investment. Here is the assumption that was baked into every layer of that architecture. The attacker will come from outside. The attacker will travel in a detectable way. The attacker will follow a flight profile that gives the defender enough decision time to engage. Those 3 assumptions form the foundation. And Ukraine, with patience, with engineering, and with a level of doctrinal creativity that Russian military planners never attributed to it, has now destroyed all 3 simultaneously. Let me walk you through what that actually means at the strategic level, because the mechanics matter here. When Ukraine began scaling its indigenous long-range drone program in the second half of 2023, Western analysts, and I include a broad community of serious institutional analysts in this, largely assessed the operational value as psychological and symbolic. Cheap drones would irritate Russian rear areas. They would force air defense deployments to stretch. They would create some infrastructure damage. That was the prevailing assessment of the program's ceiling. I want to be direct. That assessment was wrong, not because the analysts were careless, but because they were measuring the weapon against the existing doctrine rather than watching how the doctrine was being rewritten around the weapon. Ukraine was not building a harassment capability. Ukraine was building a geometry disruption capability. Those are fundamentally different things, and that distinction is the hidden military variable that mainstream coverage still has not located. Here's what geometry disruption means in practical terms. A single high-value asset, a ballistic missile, an advanced cruise missile, presents an air defense system with one engagement problem. The system detects it, tracks it, calculates an intercept solution, and fires. The system has been designed and trained to do exactly this. The problem becomes mathematically different when you present not one engagement problem, but 47 simultaneous engagement problems arriving from 11 different vectors, traveling at varying speeds, at varying altitudes, some carrying warheads, some carrying nothing, some programmed to loiter, some programmed to dive on air defense radar emitters specifically. Now, the system is not solving one problem. It is solving 47 problems with finite interceptor inventory, finite radar bandwidth, and finite human decision capacity inside a compressed time envelope. That is not a raid. That is an engineering attack on the architecture of air defense itself. And what happens next changes everything, because this is where the escalation logic becomes truly consequential. Once you have forced a layered air defense system to expend interceptors, Pantsir missiles, S-300 rounds, even S-400 rounds against low-cost aerial vehicles, you have done something that cannot be undone quickly. Those interceptors are not cheap. An S-400 interceptor round costs somewhere between $1 and $4 million, depending on variant. A Pantsir engagement sequence burns through ammunition that takes months to replace through a Russian defense industrial base that is already working under sanctions pressure, raw material constraints, and prioritized frontline resupply demands. Ukraine's drones, the Shahed derivatives, the domestically developed long-range variants, cost between $50,000 and $300,000 each. You do not need a doctorate in operations research to understand the exchange rate mathematics. Russia is burning expensive strategic inventory to destroy cheap tactical hardware, and it cannot sustain that exchange indefinitely without degrading the coverage density that makes the air defense network protective rather than nominal. Pull the lens back further, because the numbers from last night are not an isolated data point. They are a point on a trend line that has been running in one direction for 8 months. Let me walk you through the milestone sequence, because the chronology is not incidental. It is the argument. In the early spring of this year, Ukrainian long-range drone strikes began consistently reaching targets in Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod oblasts. Russian air defenses intercepted a high percentage of incoming vehicles, and Russian state media presented the interception rates as evidence that the system was working. That framing was tactically accurate and strategically misleading. The relevant metric was not the interception percentage. The relevant metric was the rate at which Ukraine was forcing air defense battery deployments away from the front, stretching radar coverage, and identifying gaps in the sensor network through the behavior of the defense itself. Every time a Russian radar emitter turns on to track an incoming drone, it reveals its location, its frequency, its rotation rate, and its coverage geometry. Ukraine was not just flying drones, it was conducting systematic reconnaissance of the electromagnetic architecture of Russian air defense across a theater-wide area. That is a fundamentally different operation than what the interception statistics suggest. By late spring, the strike packages began reaching Smolensk and Voronezh, still intercepted at high rates, still reported as Russian air defense successes, and still methodically revealing the architecture of the system to Ukrainian electronic intelligence. Then comes the critical escalation phase, beginning roughly in early summer, when Ukrainian strike packages began appearing over Moscow Oblast at a frequency that forced the Russian government to deploy additional Pantsir systems and S-350 assets to defend the capital region specifically. This matters enormously, because every asset redeployed to Moscow defense is an asset pulled from a different coverage zone. Air defense is not infinite. It is a finite inventory of systems covering a finite geographic space. When you force the defender to prioritize the capital, you create coverage shadows everywhere else. Ukraine understood this. Russia structurally could not avoid it, and it gets even more serious from here. In the 6 weeks preceding last night's operation, Ukrainian strike packages began demonstrating a new tactical signature that I want to describe precisely, because this is the doctrinal inflection point. Previous packages followed relatively predictable vector distributions, approaching from the northeast, from over the Bryansk corridor, along routes that Russian radar operators had spent months characterizing and building intercept solutions against. The new packages began exhibiting what I would describe as variable geometry launch profiles, different origin points, different flight altitudes across the package, different timing intervals between vehicles in the same strike sequence, some vehicles flying direct routes to target, others flying indirect routes designed to arrive from azimuths that the defending radar network had lower coverage density on, This is not improvisation. This is deliberate, systematic exploitation of the coverage map that Ukraine's months-long reconnaissance campaign had built. Last night's operation over Moscow was the maturation of that campaign. Let me tell you what the numbers reveal, because numerical precision is the antidote to vague impression management. The strike package that reached Moscow Oblast included, based on available open source analysis, not fewer than 60 discrete aerial vehicles, possibly significantly more. Russian air defense systems acknowledged engaging targets in at least 7 separate sectors of the capital defense zone simultaneously. 7 sectors. That means the package was not flowing through a single approach corridor that the defense could concentrate against. It was forcing simultaneous engagement decisions across the entire spatial envelope of Moscow's defensive umbrella. The S-400 batteries protecting the capital were firing. The Pantsir systems deployed around government and military infrastructure were firing. And they were firing not in a coordinated, prioritized sequence against a defined threat axis, but reactively against a 3-dimensional swarm geometry that the engagement protocols were not designed to handle. What happened next changes everything, because despite all of that firing, infrastructure was struck. That is not a minor detail. That is the point. The question I want you to sit with for a moment is this: what does it mean for Russian strategic confidence when Moscow's air defense fires depletes interceptor inventory and still cannot prevent impact on the capital? Because the answer to that question operates at a level far above the tactical. It operates at the level of political psychology, military credibility, and deterrence logic. And all three have just been fundamentally altered. Let me explain the industrial and state-level consequences now, because this is where the analysis moves from the battlefield to the boardroom in the Kremlin corridor. Russia's air defense industrial base is under simultaneous compression from 3 directions. First, sanctions and export controls have disrupted the microelectronic supply chains that Russian precision manufacturing depends on. Domestically produced substitutes exist in some categories and are inadequate or absent in others. This is not a theoretical constraint. It is a documented, quantified production bottleneck that Russian defense procurement officials have internally acknowledged in ways that have surfaced in open source and intelligence reporting. Second, frontline consumption is enormous. The rate at which Russian air defense systems are being used in combat, both offensively and defensively, across the entire theater of operations, is drawing down stockpiles that were sized for a different kind of conflict over a much shorter timeline. Third, and most importantly for the Moscow scenario, Russia is now being forced to defend 2 geographic priorities simultaneously: the front line, where Ukrainian precision strikes are degrading ammunition depots, headquarters, logistics nodes, and radar installations, in the capital, where political necessity demands visible defensive coverage regardless of the operational cost. That is a resource allocation dilemma with no good solution. Prioritize the front, and Moscow's symbolic and administrative infrastructure becomes demonstrably vulnerable, as it now demonstrably is. Prioritize the capital, and the front degrades faster, which accelerates the operational pressure that generates the drone strikes in the first place. This is what a strategic trap looks like when it closes. Not a single dramatic moment, a tightening logic from which the assumptions of the previous posture cannot escape. And the economic arithmetic does not get better with time. Ukraine's drone production capacity has been growing, not linearly, but exponentially in certain categories, through a combination of domestic industrial scaling, Western component supply, and a production model that deliberately prioritizes cheap, numerous, and replaceable over expensive, sophisticated, and scarce. Russia's interceptor production capacity is constrained by exactly the factors I described. The trend lines are moving in opposite directions, and the crossover point, the point at which Ukraine can consistently generate saturation strike packages faster than Russia can replenish the interceptor inventory to defeat them, is not a distant theoretical possibility. Based on production rates, consumption data, and the operational tempo visible in the last 90 days, that crossover is either already occurring in specific geographic sectors or is close enough that Russian air defense planners must be treating it as an operational planning constraint right now. Let me pull the lens back to the climactic operation, because last night was not simply an extension of the previous trend. It was a deliberate demonstration of a new capability threshold, and the choice of target was not accidental. Moscow is not just a geographic location. Moscow is the symbolic center of the Russian state's claim to invulnerability. The entire political narrative that Putin's government has maintained domestically, that the war is a limited special military operation, that Russian territory and Russian population centers are protected, that the military is performing its mission, depends on a perception of strategic immunity at home. When Ukrainian drones reach Moscow, circle over the capital, force air defense systems to fire visibly in the night sky over a city of 12 million people, and still produce impacts that the Russian government cannot fully suppress in its own media environment, that narrative takes structural damage. Not rhetorical damage, structural damage, the kind that compounds over time. The specific targeting logic of last night's operation also deserves analysis because it was not random. Based on available reporting, the strike packages appear to have prioritized three categories of infrastructure: communications relay nodes associated with the command architecture of the Moscow air defense sector, which creates information gaps in exactly the sensor network Ukraine needs, degraded logistics and fuel infrastructure in the Moscow exurban zone, which serves both economic and military supply functions, and notably an approach corridor that appears designed to stress test the engagement geometry of the S-400 battery network defending the southwestern approach to the capital, the coverage zone that previous strike packages had identified as having lower sensor redundancy than the northern and eastern approaches. This is not a random act of violence against civilian infrastructure. This is a precision engineering attack on the architecture of Russian air defense in its most politically sensitive geographic zone. The sophistication of that targeting logic is the real headline, not the fires, the reasoning behind the fires. And the reasoning has a forward implication that I want to be direct about, because this is where the strategic forecast becomes consequential. If Ukraine has now demonstrated the capability to conduct geometry disruption strike operations against Moscow's air defense network, then every Russian asset currently located in the Moscow region on the assumption of strategic immunity has to be reassessed. Strategic bombers, command and control infrastructure, air defense system storage and maintenance facilities, government continuity installations. All of these exist where they exist, partly because of the assumption that Moscow was beyond practical Ukrainian strike range and certainly beyond the capability of Ukrainian systems to penetrate in the face of layered air defense. That assumption is no longer operative. And when a foundational assumption of your strategic posture is no longer operative, the entire structure built on it requires either reinforcement, which costs resources Russia does not have in surplus, or relocation, which is operationally disruptive and publicly visible and therefore politically damaging in its own right. Russia has no good move here. That is what a successful strategic trap looks like once it has closed. Let me give you the doctrinal verdict, because that is ultimately what this event demands. What Ukraine has proven, not hypothetically, but operationally and repeatedly, and now in the most symbolically significant possible geographic location, is that layered air defense designed around Cold War threat assumptions cannot be adapted quickly enough to defeat a sophisticated swarm and saturation attacker that controls the geometry, the timing, and the cost exchange ratio of the engagement. That is not a lesson about drones. That is a lesson about the bankruptcy of static defensive architecture in the face of an adversary willing to invest in asymmetric volume and doctrinal creativity rather than symmetric firepower matching. Russia built its air defense network to defeat the threat it expected. Ukraine attacked the threat modeling assumptions themselves. And those assumptions, once exposed as inadequate in the real-world crucible of operational testing, cannot be quietly corrected. They can only be expensively replaced if the industrial base and the resource availability permit replacement, or managed around through workarounds that introduce their own vulnerabilities and their own costs. The history of this war will record that Russia entered it with a military architecture built for a conflict it had spent 20 years imagining, and that Ukraine spent 3 years systematically dismantling the assumptions on which that architecture rested, not by outspending Russia, not by fielding more sophisticated weapon systems, but by outthinking the doctrinal logic at every level of the kill chain. Last night over Moscow was not a turning point. It was a confirmation that the turning had already occurred, and that the consequences are now compounding in ways Russia cannot reverse within the timeline that matters. The question that this leaves open, and it is the right question to carry into the weeks ahead, is not whether Russia's air defense architecture is now structurally compromised. The operational evidence has answered that. The question is whether the political and military leadership in Moscow has the capacity to acknowledge what the evidence shows and adapt accordingly, or whether the institutional rigidity and the narrative management requirements of the current political system will prevent the kind of honest doctrinal reassessment that the situation demands. Based on everything I have seen across 24 months of watching how Russian military and political leadership processes operational failure, I do not assess that honest reassessment as likely, and that means the trap stays closed. Stay with us, because the next phase of this strategic unraveling is already in motion, and the implications reach considerably further than what happened over Moscow last night.